a wide range of emotions, including some relief and solace, sadness and anger, and more. But hopefully a renewed energy and commitment to continue our collective efforts to eliminate structural racism in this country. In the words of George Floyd's brother, he said, "It feels like maybe we can finally take a breath." However, we all know that this cannot erase the decades and centuries of injustices to Black people. This verdict is only a first step in a long journey, but perhaps this can provide some hope and inspiration for us to continue to push for an equitable and just society. So I'd simply like to ask that we take a moment to remember George Floyd, along with all of the others who have unjustly lost their lives at the hands of indifference and those in power throughout the history of this country and in more modern times from Emmett Till through until today. Let's just take a moment to reflect. Okay, thank you all. So let me, before we move to today's event, let me announce our upcoming events in our HIV Center. On April 27th, we have, this is not a rounds event, it's a Tuesday. Those of you who are familiar with our cross core, we're having a special seminar with Dr. Seth Kalishman from the University of Connecticut, and he's the lead editor of the Journal of AIDS and Behavior, and a collaborator with some of us. And he'll be speaking with us in a workshop called Finding the Right Angle, a geometric approach to measuring intersectional stigma. So please join us for that on April 27th. And then our upcoming, announced the two next HIV Center Grand Rounds on May 6th. We have from our own home, Will Beckham, who will talk about HIV and transmasculine people, knowledge, gaps, and future directions. And then we have Christine Real talking about tailoring long-acting biomedical HIV prevention strategies to the needs of transgender women, what we know so far. And then I'll announce our second grand rounds in May 20th. Dazon Dixon Diallo, who's a recognized visionary and advocate in the struggle for human rights, sexual and reproductive justice, and the fight against HIV. She's also a senior advisor to our HIV Center. She'll be speaking on innovating justice in the HIV response, shifting power, and sharing strength to end the epidemic. So now on to today's event. And let me remind everyone, I think everyone is, to be on mute during this, so you can open up for the Q&A that we'll have. So we're very privileged to have Dr. Iván Balán speaking with us today at our rounds. And he will speak. This is a little bit different from our normal rounds. We're going to actually end the formal rounds at 10:30, roughly around 10:30, give or take. And what we're going to do after 10:30 until 11:30, for those of you who know Dr. Iván Balán, everyone is welcome to stay with us. We're going to spend an hour honoring him, our dear colleague, who's leaving us for a warmer climate. But he will still remain as a collaborator for many of us. So let me formally introduce him now. After 25 years at Columbia University Medical Center, Iván Balán is now a research professor at the Florida State University College of Medicine, where he's an investigator at the Center for Translational Behavioral Science. He's a clinical psychologist. Iván came to us in 1994 to work at what is now the Lucy Wick Clinic for HIV mental health at New York Presbyterian Hospital, where he provided psychotherapy to individuals and groups affected by HIV. Shortly after arriving, he became involved in research at our HIV Center, conducting participant interviews for studies being conducted by Alex Caballo-Dieguez, who is with us today, and myself in my study. In 2002, he moved from clinical work to full-time research at New York State Psychiatric Institute, splitting his time between the Anxiety Disorders Clinic and the HIV Center. At the Anxiety Disorder Clinic, he was involved in psychotherapy research, developed expertise in motivational interviewing, and developed and implemented a number of motivational interviewing-based interventions for use in NIH-funded studies. At the HIV Center, he was a co-investigator on many studies, particularly led by Alex Caballo-Dieguez, and collaborated with other principal investigators. In April 2016, after receiving the notice of award for his first R01 and obtaining a large subcontract from the Microbicides Trials Network, On the HOPE study, which he did all in 1 week, it happened in 1 week, he consolidated all his work at the HIV Center. Since then, he successfully completed the R01, whose results we will hear about today. So that's great. For the HOPE study, he developed and implemented a motivational interviewing-based intervention to support use of the dapivirine ring among women in sub-Saharan Africa, for which he trained 65 counselors in 14 study sites across 4 countries to deliver the intervention in local languages. Ivan's work in the HOPE study was lauded for its rigorous approach to training, monitoring, and coaching to ensure it was delivered with fidelity to support using this ring. Ivan and his team here at the HIV Center published 6 manuscripts on this work, with just another one in review. Based on that success, he was asked to again develop and implement the adherence counseling intervention for 2 other microbicide trial network studies that compare the safety and acceptability of oral PrEP and the dapivirine ring in pregnant and breastfeeding women. He is currently working on his follow-up study to the SMARTtest study, whose results we will hear about today. And of course, Ivan, as I said before, will remain an affiliate of the HIV Center, so you're not going away, Ivan. But I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bob. And thank you, everyone, for coming to, well, at least my last rounds presentation as an HIV Center investigator. I remember the first time that I did this, and it felt like such an incredible shift. It was like finally I got to sit at the adult table at Thanksgiving dinner. And that was many, many years ago. So I'm thrilled to finish off my time at the HIV Center with this presentation. So I'm going to be speaking to you about our work assessing the acceptability and feasibility of using the INSTI Multiplex for self and partner testing, along with the app that we developed to facilitate its use. So just some basic background. The acceptability of using rapid HIV tests for self and partner testing is well established among different populations, certainly among men who have sex with men and transgender women. Much of that work comes from the HIV Center with Alex's studies, but we've also seen it expanded to female sex workers here in the US and in Africa, and also partnered women in sub-Saharan Africa. And we see that self-testing increases the frequency of testing among groups at high risk of infection. Equally important is that when we provide individuals with tests to then test their partners, this tends to reach individuals who are often unaware of their HIV infection. And it also informs sexual decision-making to reduce risk of HIV infection. To date, however, all of these studies have used an oral fluid test, usually the Oroquip. The one certain positive of using a combined HIV and syphilis rapid test is that it would also allow individuals to increase rates of testing for syphilis. And we keep hearing consistently that there are increasing rates of syphilis incidence in the US and throughout the world. One thing to keep in mind during this entire presentation is that CDC recommends that individuals at high risk of infection be tested for syphilis, chlamydia, and gonorrhea, and HIV every 3 to 6 months, because we see that that is very difficult to maintain. So yet, with all of this research and acceptability, some concerns remain, as do questions. So among potential users, there's concerns about correct use, whether they will read the test results correctly, and if they get a positive result, how they will link to care. Furthermore, there's a little bit of a complaint that HIV tests don't test for other STDs. So it's just that one single infection. So among some of the questions that come up is how might technology assist rapid HIV home testing? If we are going to test for combined HIV and syphilis tests, would people actually use a blood-based test at home? And could they engage their partners to do so? And also, how can we improve linkage to care? Because it's a main challenge that remains in HIV home testing. So one of the potential answers to that came from this device that we were alerted to by our program officer at NICHD when we were working on Alex's home testing study. And the M-chip dongle was developed by Sam Sia and his team at the Columbia University School of Engineering, the Department of Biomedical Engineering. And this was developed for nurses in Rwanda, in the field. And it's a dual HIV syphilis test that tests for triple and non-triple syphilis. It's custom built, and we're building in their lab. A very nice thing about this is that, because you can see, so what you see here is the image on the right was their earlier version, which actually attached to the smartphone. The other one that you see is a later version that connects to the smartphone via Bluetooth. But with the smartphone enabled, then you can really provide clearer results. And these results, instead of being provided in lines or dots, were provided in words. There was high accuracy and acceptability among nurses and patients. And really important, especially in terms of research and service provision, is it allows for remote monitoring of test results. So every time a result is conducted, those results are sent, a test is conducted, those results are sent to research staff or clinic staff. So with that in mind, we developed this study, which was a two-phase study. The first to assess the acceptability of using fingerprint tests for self and partner testing among MSM and transgender women, and then to develop and optimize the app that would accompany the test. Sia's team had developed an initial version of the app, which is very rudimentary and also focused for the nurses. Our goal was to revise it so that it would be for the self-testing user at home. And in phase two, we would assess the feasibility of using the SMARTtest to test sexual partners by giving them a number of test kits to use over a 3-month period. So some brief things on phase one, because this really was a formative phase for what came afterwards. So our sample here, as in all the other self-testing studies that we have done under Alex, was people at high risk of HIV and this is syphilis infection. So they were HIV infected, non-monogamous, reported frequent condomless anal intercourse, and reported never or rarely using condoms during anal intercourse. We also specifically recruited 20 from Alex's study, which was still ongoing. So these individuals who had completed that study, but we wanted to include folks that were already experienced with home testing, and we knew that they could easily do it with partners. So we were able to recruit 56 MSM and 3 transgender women, and the sample was diverse in age, race, ethnicity, and education. So basically they came in, completed a CASI, they self-tested using the instruction provided on the smartphone app. Then afterwards, they completed in-depth interviews on acceptability of the test and components that they would like in the app. Then we did a rapid data analysis and conducted and convened a focus group of 6 participants from phase 1, and they would be working with us over the next few months to review versions of the app, provide feedback, so then we could then do the next version of the app. So halfway through the phase 1, we hit a snag, as may often happen in studies. So our participants didn't like the M-chip dongle. It was too clunky. It definitely wasn't sexy. Let's keep in mind that in these studies, many of our participants are using or doing the testing during a sexual encounter. This felt very clinical. We also noted that there were too many user errors. So 55% of the results resulted in them being invalid. So we were concerned about accurate home use during phase 2 of the study. Nonetheless, we saw that there was high ratings for the app content. They loved video and step-by-step instructions, and the fact that results were delivered in words, not lines. So participants seemed much more enthralled by the app than by the testing device. So we stopped enrollment at 40 participants and then switched to assess their use and acceptability of the INSTI and the Syphilis Health Check, both of which are FDA-approved tests, which was an advantage over the M-chip dongle, which was much more in earlier in its development. The INSTI is used in clinic settings here in the US, and there's an INSTI self-test that is approved in Europe. So here, once we switched over to this, was our goal then was to develop an app to support the use of these products, including figuring out a way to scan results, to provide results in words, and to also allow us to monitor the use of the test. And here are some of the findings that we had in terms of things that people wanted in this app. And this all came from the in-depth interviews and from the focus group discussion. One, in terms of the instructions, people really liked both the video and the step-by-step instructions. The video provided an overview of what the testing process would be like, and the step-by-step instructions allow participants to proceed at their own pace. As I mentioned, all participants prefer to spell out test results to lines or dots. Key in here, though, is that when we heard from the focus group that it was really important that before the actual results were presented, people should be prepared that in the next screen, their results would show up in case they just wanted to abort the process at that point. We asked about HIV and syphilis information, and participants favored succinct information about HIV and syphilis. They didn't want everything included in here and overwhelming the app. They wanted the app to be simple and focus on HIV and syphilis testing. However, they also thought that syphilis information was really critical since a lot less information is disseminated about syphilis than about HIV. And they recognized the importance for referral capabilities of linkage to care. But we saw a wide disparity in how people wanted that done. Some folks wanted a geospatial mapping of clinics that were nearby. Others wanted absolutely nothing with that and just wanted a list of places that they could go to. Now, once you scan your results, it provides a lot of opportunities for what you can do with those results. So we asked about these. Many participants were interested in being able to save their results onto the app. This would allow them to track one's tests and to also show others their tests. You know, in our previous studies with Alex, our participants, whenever they would use a test with a new partner, they would have to test again. So this would allow, especially since the fingerprint, this would allow people who had used a test recently to just show their partners that test result. But it was also clear that we needed to safeguard the partner's privacy. So partners' results should not allow to be saved. An interesting thing that developed was how this would allow for sharing of test results. And Brian Cutner wrote an excellent paper on this that is currently in press. And participants expressed an interest in sharing with sexual partners. Conversations about zero status often occurs. So this would be a way of transmitting that information to their sexual partners, and also with healthcare providers. Others saw sharing as a means to normalize testing. So as you see here, we had a few participants who were thinking of actually posting this on Facebook because there was a way to normalize this process. And it was also self-check for themselves that they wanted to maintain this. It was a way of highlighting their commitment to remaining HIV negative. Others noted that really by scanning results, these results weren't authenticated and somebody could actually deceive people because there was no way to ensure that the test result that was being sent was of the person who was sending those results. And lastly, as we looked at this, the focus groups thought that there needed to be different modes, whether you were testing yourself only, your partner, or dual testing. And the goal was this to facilitate this process. Right? So here, this gives you an idea of the architecture of the app, right? And I'll show you some specifics in a second, right? So basically, you're the intro screens, you have all the instructions, and that takes up about 16 screens. Here's the results management and the scanning, which is another 7 screens. right? So it actually, as you build all of this out, it winds up being quite a large product. So let me take you a little bit through how this goes. So here's the face page. You sign in with your username and password. You would have selected whether this was a test for you, for a partner, or a dual test. And you're introduced to a video that's upcoming. Now, one of the things that we notice is that even though we're giving them specific instructions to wait for the step-by-step instructions, oftentimes we had participants who were trying to match their conducting of the test to the video, which was just too fast. So one of those details that you learn, there was multiple warnings, wait until the step-by-step instructions. And here you see examples of the step-by-step instructions. We are indebted to Cody for his hands and his blood in doing this work. We were also very fortunate that just as we were ready to do this, Brian came on as a postdoc. Those of you who know Brian know he has a perfect voice to narrate, so he's the narrator on this. And so basically here you have an INSTI test, and you put your camera over your cell phone camera over it, and it scans the results. And this is how the results show up. So you see HIV negative, syphilis positive, you have the date and time, and the opportunity to access different things. There's also an important caveat about how you should be reading these test results and the need for confirmation. If this individual were to decide to send the test results to someone, this is what the other person would receive. And it would be sent not from the participant's phone, but directly from the server, so that there is no identifying information, including the phone number of the person who's sending these results. Here you have the list of different resources that we included in the app. We had a backup page on how to interpret the results, information about accuracy, window period, HIV, syphilis info, and nearby clinics. And what we did was create a list. We combined that geographic, mapping with the list, and we created a list that could be filtered based on location, based on certain other qualities, such as whether the services were free, whether they're specifically LGBT focused. So that's the app that we launched in phase 2. And in phase 2, we use the INSTI Multiplex, which is a combined HIV and syphilis test, but only a non-triple test. You get the results in 1 minute. It is not sold in the US. It is not currently FDA approved in the US, but we were able to obtain permission because it's a low risk test. For those of you who are not familiar with the INSTI Multiplex or with the INSTI, because they function the same way, it's a very simple test. So you see, here's the test, here's a little well. This is an alcohol swab, here's the lancet, and you have these 3 vials. So basically, to perform the test, you wipe your finger with the alcohol swab, you massage the tip a little bit to prepare for the blood flow, you lance it. You would open these up and you put 1 drop of blood into vial 1, you cap it, and you invert it 2 or 3 times to mix the blood. And you pour it into the little well. At the bottom of the well is a membrane, so it just soaks right through. Then you immediately pour in vial 2, and immediately you pour in vial 3. It takes about 1 minute, and you get this. And this is how it would display the results of someone who is both HIV, whose test results are both HIV reactive and syphilis reactive. So for the enrollment process, we followed what we have typically done in Alex's study. Again, we use Craigslist and social networking apps to pre-screen people over the phone. Once they came in, they completed a CASI. You see some of the assessments that we conducted during the CASI. They self-tested using the INSTI Multiplex, guided by the SMARTtest app. Our staff would not provide any instructions unless they the individual was doing something that placed them at risk. Those who were eligible based on amount of sexual risk behavior, HIV serostatus, were enrolled. One key criteria for enrolling was that in assessment, they stated they felt able to handle possible violent reactions from proposing or using the INSTI with a partner. If they enrolled in the study, we provided them with 10 INSTI Multiplex kits and the SMARTtest app for use over 3 months. After 3 months, they came back for a follow-up visit. We were able to, we wound up enrolling 50 individuals, and we were able to retain 48 of them. So they came back to the CASI, and they reported on the use of the test and the app. We used an adapted MARS to assess the functionality of the app, and also ratings on the helpfulness of different SMARTtest components, which I will show you a little bit later. And then they had an in-depth interview discussing the experiences of using the INSTI for self and partner testing, as well as to provide feedback on content and features of the app. So as you can see, these are the demographics from our 48 participants. They are beautifully diverse in terms of race and ethnicity, level of education. Here, our goal was to recruit 20% of participants who would be transgender women, and we were able to achieve that and surpass it a little bit. We were thrilled. We see that here we come back. Remember that for these high-risk individuals, they should be testing for HIV every 3 to 6 months. We see that almost a third have not tested in a year. Okay. About a third had also taken place in Alex's study, so they were experienced self and partner test users. And a little bit more, almost 50% had ever used an OraQuick for self-testing. That wasn't just in the study, but also for personal use. And we see that a little bit over a quarter had used PrEP, and 15% were using PrEP during this study. This was also the first study in which we allowed enrollment by individuals taking PrEP. And that was because in prior studies focused on HIV testing, we didn't think that MSM or individuals on PrEP would take the time to use a test with partners. Right? Because the study also focused on syphilis, we thought it was important to enroll them, and folks on PrEP were interested in it. So after 3 months, 77% of participants reported they used the INSTI to self-test, and they did so multiple times during that period. 26 participants, or just over half, used the INSTI to test a partner. 33 participants asked 162 partners to test, and 40% of those partners agreed and completed the test. And very importantly, we saw that there were a few difficulties in performing the test or interpreting the results. On the right-hand side here, you see that for self-testing, 100% of individuals reported they would definitely or likely use the INSTI multiplex for that process. Decreased a little bit for testing sexual partners, especially one-night stands. When we speak about testing sexual partners, this can range from individuals that our participants met that day for the first time, or people that they have known for a long time, and they decided to test. And it might also be testing primary partners. So the INSTI for self-testing, among those participants who had not been involved in our previous home testing studies and were new to self-testing, they found this convenient and much more private than a clinic environment. This is not unusual because this is what we usually see and hear from participants when they first experience self-testing. Others were much more focused on liking the INSTI specifically for self-testing because of the quickness of the results. Keep in mind, OraQuick takes about 20 minutes. This is 1 minute. And how quickly this was people perceive that it will allow them to test more frequently. Many also like the ease of use. And of course, inclusion of a syphilis test, aside from an HIV test, was a highlight for many of the participants. Like this individual that we see there, who hasn't had an STI before. And as many of our participants would say, they don't oftentimes think about syphilis infection. So the ability to have a test that has both of an HIV and a syphilis test embedded is a win-win. Here we return to the question of a blood-based test. Most participants did not have a problem with the blood-based test. Quite a few of them referred it to, to checking for diabetes. Some of our participants had diabetes or their family members. But when we saw difficulties in using the test, it was often around the blood sample, right? Not being able to get enough blood, or for some people, once they lance themselves, stopping the bleeding, so they could continue with the test. And in general, people found the sequencing and the actual use of the test to be very, very simple. So INSTI for testing partners. And Cody Lenz wrote a really nice article on this and how people approach partners to test. So we see that about 69% of the participants approached partners to use the INSTI with at least one partner. And of those, about half proposed INSTI use to somebody that had just met or were going to have sex with for the first time. We also see that about 44% did not discuss INSTI testing with any of their partners. And there might be a range of reasons for that, including we have people come back and say that they really weren't that sexually active during those 3 months, to people feel not knowing how to approach it or having concerns about approaching it with a partner. Some of the approaches that we see are successful, or that partners or our participants use, were framing the use of the kits as being part of a research study, or integrating testing into a larger conversation about sexual health. And lastly, using the INSTI as a mutually beneficial tool to facilitate joint testing. So oftentimes our participants tested along with their partners because that facilitated the conversation and that made the partner feel more comfortable in testing. So some participants felt that approaching this with partners that they knew would make it a lot easier, right? And those partners would be more comfortable testing. However, that didn't always work out. We also had partners that when they approached we also had participants that when they approached their ongoing partners, those partners felt a bit defensive because they felt they were being challenged in some way. So we had other participants who thought that offering a test to a new sexual partner was easier, and they were very successful at it. This quote here is wonderful and really captures what we're trying to do. Except that ideally he would have tested the partner before they had sex, right? So I was like, hey, by the way, I'm in this cool research study. Can I prick your finger and just like for my own ease, because you did nut inside of me to confirm that you're HIV and syphilis negative? And he was like, yeah, sure. He didn't flinch. He ended up coming up negative as was expected. And this partner loved the whole app and the results page. So he asked the participant to do a screenshot and to send it to him. And with the last one, we also see the importance of using humor in engaging partners in testing. So when testing partners, most of the participants actually performed the test on their partners rather than letting the partners test themselves. Participants were feeling very comfortable using the INSTI. They found it simple. So they thought it was an easier way of having partners agree to be tested. But we also had many sexual partners who refused to test. And this was both due, well, in some occasions, it was just due to not wanting to test, do any HIV test with a as part of a study like this. For others, it involved specifically the fingerprint. So we did have 15 individuals that participants tested reactive. Now, most of these were because those individuals were known to be HIV positive. And sometimes our participants like to test them to see how the test works. We did have one participant who tested 2 partners who received unexpected reactive HIV test results. And as we have seen in other studies, our participants tend to be very supportive of these partners and often try to remain in contact with them and have, in some cases, accompany them for follow-up and confirmatory testing. The syphilis reactive results presented some interesting findings, which we hadn't seen before. A few participants had partners receive reactive test results. In almost all of those situations, these were considered to reflect past infections. The INSTI shows up as reactive if you've had a past treated syphilis infection. One transgender woman who engages in sex work had 2 partners receive unexpected reactive syphilis results. But as we can see from this quote from her in-depth interview, it was something that was really appreciated by the partners. And she in turn felt she had done a really great service for them and felt wonderful about the experience. Of course, in these situations with people involved in sex work testing their sex partners, that has raised all sorts of concerns. But we see here that it can also be handled very well. Some of the particularly interesting things about this, dealing with the syphilis results, is what happened with our own participants. So we had one participant who tested positive for syphilis at her follow-up visit. So it wasn't while during the 3-month period. It was when she came back from her interview. We had one other participant who acquired syphilis again during the study participation. So when he came in and tested during the baseline, his syphilis test showed reactive, so he knew about this. He also explained it to partners. Yet, when he was testing other partners whose syphilis results were coming up reactive, that was always attributed to a past treated infection. Only at some point to be informed by one of his partners that he had acquired syphilis, and he contacted the participant. So for him, that really was a bummer, to put it mildly, since he had been so cautious about testing people, and this occurred. And it really highlighted the limitations of this component of the INSTI, right? That it can't differentiate between an active and past infection. We also had individuals who, when they tested at baseline and had a syphilis reactive result, what to do with it? Because that meant that every time you would test with a partner, that would show up, and you would have to explain that whole thing. Right? And we had people deal with it in a number of ways. Right? So 2 of our participants had that conversation with their partners. 2 tested partners, but we couldn't, it wasn't clear if they had discussed their own syphilis results. 2 just didn't use any test during the study. And 1 used a test, but didn't mutually test, only tested a partner. And 1 showed partners the HIV results, he had saved on his phone, but not his syphilis results. So he blocked that with his finger. And the situation is well encapsulated by this individual's statement, so that basically when he realizes that every time he tests with the INSTI multiplex, if it's going to come out reactive for syphilis, he realized that that's going to be a very difficult conversation to have with participants, and they're not really going to understand what's going to be happening, and it will impede the encounters. Christine Rael also focused on the experiences of transgender women using the INSTI, and that also seemed to go very well with this group, who's also obviously at such increased risk of infection. So, as I mentioned before, there were 11 transgender participants. We saw no violence and no positive HIV screenings. everyone was able to use the test and interpret the test correctly. And one of the things that was interesting, particularly about this group, was the different settings in which they use the test. Yet they always remain strategic about who they would propose a test to and devise unique strategies to bring up ideas and address any issue. So at the end, 100% of them would consider using would be likely to use the INSTI for self-testing, and 90% for partner testing. So let's quickly look at some of the functionality of the SMARTtest, what people thought of the SMARTtest app. Here are the 5 domains that the MARS covers, and these are rated on a scale of 1 to 5. So the overall mean for the review of the SMARTtest was a 4.16, which we were quite happy with, and over 3/4 would recommend the app to a friend. Highlights about what they said was the app increased their comfort with testing partners for HIV and STIs. It was helpful for finding follow-up services and increased knowledge of HIV and syphilis testing. This was the helpful list of the components that I mentioned before. These are the different parts of the SMARTtest app, and we had individuals rate this on a 1 to 7 scale. And overall, the mean rating was a 6.13 out of 7, so we were quite happy with that. We see that people are found the instructions, the step-by-step and video instructions to be most helpful. User login, which we'll see is an area that people had some difficulty with, was the lowest. And also the use of a guest account. So some quick impressions of the app. Participants viewed it as cool, easy to use, self-explanatory, and simple to navigate. The video instructions were especially helpful. And of course, participants really like the sense of having the words positive and negative instead of having to decipher results, and the ability of sharing results with others. One of the things that I will mention about the scanning of results, the goal of the scanner is to be more accurate than the human eye. So in an INSTI test, you should have absolutely no reaction or color shading of a dot if the result is non-reactive. So the scanning app will pick up even the faintest of shadings to suggest or to recommend follow-up testing. We also had a lot of people not use the app. Right? So they considered the purpose of the app to show them how to use the test. They had come into the baseline interview, they had used the test, they had used it well, it had no problems, they found it really easy. So they didn't use the app. Yet everyone thought that it was helpful to have in case that it was needed. Kind of like IKEA instructions for building furniture. Right? We had just a few challenges in using the app. One was in accessing or logging into the app, people forgetting their password. One of the things that we didn't do, which because it was going to complicate the back functioning, was an easy password reset, and this was a challenge for folks. The scanning feature sometimes didn't perform well due to bad lighting, the quality of the phone's camera, or other reasons, and this resulted in invalid results, which was obviously frustrating to participants. And we also noticed and had some participants express concern about actually using the app or bringing out a phone in this kind of an encounter when someone's being tested, out of fear of how participants, fear of how partners would respond, and concerns that they were being videoed or captured in some way. So, in terms of conclusions, we see that the acceptability of the INSTI multiplex for self-testing is clear and it is high. And so it bodes very well for using the INSTI multiplex for self-testing. The testing appeared to be driven about concerns about HIV. No one reported using the test out of concern for syphilis infection. Right? So a combined test like this will allow or may allow increased rates of syphilis screening and testing because it goes along with the HIV testing. As we've seen in other studies, the participant-supported partners who received reactive results, and reactive results did not preclude engaging in sex. And as I mentioned before, the reactive syphilis results were more complicated to understand, right? Because a passive infection can show up as a reactive, people didn't quite know how to do that. And as we saw, it raises a risk for individuals who may mistakenly consider a reactive result as due to a past infection without a current infection. In terms of the app, and I think this is really useful for folks that are considering developing apps, maximizing app flexibility is essential. We were being very cautious. We wanted to make sure that all the participants were reviewing the instructions again before they got to the actual test and the scanning of results. Well, participants didn't want to do that. They felt that they knew how to do the test, and this just prolonged their process, turning a 1-minute HIV syphilis test into a 5-minute process. So basically, they just skipped the app. So in a more recent iteration of the app, we tried to resolve that by allowing users to skip directly to the scanning feature. But I think it's key to remember that it's very difficult for us who are developing apps to make people do something. They will find a way around it. And always keep in mind that app functioning is reliant on the device being used, and many intended users may not have the latest technology. So next steps in this research, well, the result scanning component is unique among HIV testing apps. We didn't exploit this in this study, but we will do so in other studies, because this is the only app that allows active outreach in case of a reactive result. So as people are scanning the results, we can program it so that if there's a positive result, there's an automatic alert to research staff to reach out to that person. So we are thinking of how we can maximize that in the future. We have created an quick version of the app. And going forward, we are thinking about how we can use the app and the multiplex to support HIV self-testing mailing programs, or implementation of in community testing programs as another option for in-person testing. And Christine and I have both been writing proposals in which we're integrating this for future studies. If you are interested in looking at some of this work in more detail, here are some presentations. I'm thrilled about the productivity of the team. Oops. And lastly, I have to acknowledge that the success of this was due to a really great collaboration. Sam Sia's team in the Department of Engineering. This has been a mutually enriching experience of learning from them and then learning from us, which is what you really want in these kinds of interdisciplinary studies. And I am indebted to my team at the HIV Center for all of their work and assistance in this. And lastly, I just have to take this opportunity to express my deepest gratitude to my friends and colleagues and mentors at the HIV Center, the Anxiety Disorders Clinic, at COIMC, and at other institutions with whom I've had the pleasure of working over the past 25 years, and from whom I have learned so much. I am deeply thankful for the opportunities of my senior colleagues and the opportunities that they provided for me. And I'm very cognizant that the work that I presented now and the work on training my counselors grew out of those initial opportunities. I have to reiterate my appreciation to my team, whose commitment to my first large-scale studies allowed them to be successful, yet exciting and fun. But most meaningfully, I take with me memories of team meetings filled with laughter, our tradition of bringing back treats if we went on vacation, the genuineness of our support for each other's successes, vivid memories of Zena leading the HIV Center rounds. And of course, the team trip to Cape Town, thanks to Alex's audacity for suggesting it to Sharon Clear and her incredible support for my work. For all this and for many other reasons, I'm profoundly grateful. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ivan. That was just great. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Stephen Sukumaran, to monitor the Q&A and discussion.
And my apology that I went a little bit late.
Oh, you're forgiven. You have that right.
Okay, I'm just going to stop sharing so that I can see people's faces. There you go.
So our first question comes from Omar Martinez. Omar says, thank you for this great presentation and leading this important work. I was wondering if you could further discuss targeted marketing or communication strategies to promote self-testing. For example, content, visuals or branding, pricing, influencers, distribution strategies, communication or language.
Ooh, so that's a huge question. So I'm not a, thank you, Omar. I'm not a social marketer, so I'm not going to be able to offer much there. However, I think that, right now, and really there's a great opportunity because of COVID. A lot of community testing programs had to begin doing on-the-fly mailing programs for HIV testing. And many encountered many difficulties, including we had no idea what the tests came out to be, right? So right now, a lot of these mailing programs for HIV testing and other STI testing have occurred out of academic settings. But I think there's a great opportunity to integrate those into community testing programs that exist, right? So that we can access people that don't tend to go, to get tested in person. But also to increase the frequency of testing so people are monitoring themselves more regularly. As we know, if you seroconvert, it is so vital to get people into treatment as early as possible. So I think that's another component of this. So I think I'm looking forward to beginning to integrate this work into community testing programs to support their missions.
Our next question comes from No Kamagu Tuswa. Is there a specific reason FDA has not approved INSTI Multi? Because it will be a useful tool when you run a mobile testing service. We catch people when we can and no guarantee of them coming back, and at least we can quickly report to the city when there is a rise of cases in the community.
Yeah, that would be great. And that is their goal, is to get this FDA approved. I don't know the reasons for it. From the conversations that I have had with them, I think the concerns have been more on the syphilis test. And I'm wondering if it's part of also what we saw, right? That difficulty in really interpreting the result, not just whether it's positive or negative, but what that result for this non-triple needle test actually means to folks. So I don't know if that's where the snag is, but I know that their goal is to get it FDA approved.
And if there are any other questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask them now. We have time for maybe one or two more.
Great presentation, Ivan. This is Phil.
Thank you, Phil.
I was just wondering about if there were any patterns you might have noticed about, age groups and differences in the use and, comfort, acceptability with your project.
It was such a small group that it's difficult to parse out, differences across subgroups. None were obvious. Like from the IDIs and from the quant, there were no differences that really kind of stood out for us. although we like the fact that we included prior participants in Alex's study, that also split those were two very different groups, right? And that also kind of made it difficult to then further split them among, and compare them among different ages. So we're not seeing anything come out, or we had a nice range of ages. So at this point, what I can say is that it appears to be equally acceptable across ages. We also didn't see, I don't know if we ran anything based on age for Alex's study. Of course, Alex just finished, a couple of years ago, a much larger study. I don't think we saw age differences there.
We have another.
Thanks. Yeah, and in the future, it'd be great to talk to you. I have a ton of questions about international applications, but those are way more detailed. So hopefully, stay in touch.
Absolutely, absolutely.
We have one more question from Michael Vaughn. This was an amazing presentation. Thank you. Did any of your participants who self-disclose being sex workers discuss using the instant testing with their clients?
Oh yeah, most of them did. I think all of the ones that self-identified as sex workers talked about using them with clients. That had always, so first self-testing study that we did focused only on MSM, and I don't think we had many sex workers in that group. Then we incorporated female sex workers into the second study that Alex did. We had some sex workers among both the MSM and the female sex worker and the transgender women participants. And Rebecca wrote a paper on the use of self-testing among sex workers, and we aren't seeing many problems arise. Obviously, in that context, you are being very selective as to who you raise the possibility of testing with. There was a really great paper that came out of Africa. I'm blanking on what specific country it was from. But that was a large-scale study, and it included a large number of female sex workers. And I loved one of their concluding comments, which was, in dealing with any issues that arose, the participants used their extensive experience in dealing with similar issues during their line of work. So basically, people know who to raise this with. They're not going to raise it with partners who they feel really threatened by. If there's any unexpected negative reactions, they have the skills to kind of navigate this. So at this point, we're seeing it as also very viable for individuals involved in sex work.
Thanks, Ivan. And this will be our final question from Susie Hoffman. Do you think there is a way to get a sense of whether people would really use this with partners if they were not in a study?
So the issue with this becomes expense, right? And the cost. Here in the US, Oraquicks are $50 a pop. So making it very difficult to actually use them with partners. Now, when we come back to the question that Omar had, and the possibility of integrating this into community testing programs, who receive their test kits from regional departments of health, right? Can we do something there that, if nothing else, allows some individuals to test some of their partners, right? And therefore, we can achieve some of the benefits of this in a much more realistic way.
Thanks, Ivan, and thank you everyone for participating in the Q&A. I'll hand it back to you, Bob.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone.